Welcome back. In this video, we are going to take a look at the grid layout in CSS. We're going to see how to develop a grid of columns and rows on your page that can allow you to insert and lay out your elements into specific locations within your page. And so let's take a look at a page I have set up here. Just a very simple layout. I have an overall class wrapper that I put it inside of a div, and then I have some additional divs labeled with footer, nav, header, main, and giving it some context. And with the grid style CSS file here, I've kind of done a little bit of styling just to make it a little more evident what's going on here in the page. So we're going to style this page using CSS, and you'll see how using CSS can kind of change the way this page is laid out. We're not going to change too much in the HTML. I may add an additional div here just to show you some features and how things are working. But essentially, we're not going to change anything in the HTML. We're just going to change CSS, and we're going to make the page look different. So you can see here the footer, nav bar, header, main section, it's all kind of flowing straight down. They're all divs, and divs are block elements. So you see that they are extending all the way across the width of the page in each of these, and then they're also causing new lines to form below. Each div creates a new line, and it's being displayed the normal flow. So the first thing I inserted was the footer, and then the nav bar, then the header, then the main section, and that's how it's appearing on the page. But we're going to use the grid to reposition these elements so that they're not in that order anymore. And we're going to do that without having to change the HTML itself. So to establish a grid on the page, the first thing we're going to do is change our display to grid. And we saw some other display settings in previous videos, but here we're going to change our display to grid. And if I reset this, notice nothing happened. And that's okay, because essentially all we did was provide the ability to set up a grid, but I haven't actually set up the grid yet. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. I'm going to show you one way right now that kind of uses coordinate positioning to establish where these elements are going to be positioned. And later on, I'll show you a more visual way that you could do this. So now that I've got my wrapper, my containing element to display grid, I now need to set up the grid itself. So I'm going to do that with a grid template. And I can use grid template or grid template columns, grid template rows. So I'm going to separate these out a little bit just so that you can see what's going on here. So with my grid template columns, I can use normal pixels to establish different sets of spacing. So I could do, let's say, 100 pixels for my first column, and then I could do something maybe 300 pixels for my second column, and then maybe an FR for my last column. And if you're not familiar with what FRs stand for, they stand for fractional pieces. So what I've done is I've established a fixed width column in the beginning, a fixed width middle column, and then I've established that the rest of the last column will take up the entirety of the leftover space. So now that I've separated these into 3 columns, if I was to refresh my page, now you see that each element is fitting into the space in the grid that's available to it. So the footer was first, and then the nav bar, and then the header, followed by the main section at the end, which is filling up the first column, second column, third column, and then the fourth element is flowing into the second row. Now, even though I haven't established any rows, it's going to automatically add rows if I have elements positioned that need a place to go. It's going to add an extra row. And by default, it's just going to do that based on the size of the element that needs to fit in there. So let's go ahead and give ourselves some rows. And I'm going to use this one with all FRs. So we'll do one FR, we'll do 4 FRs, and we'll do 1 FR. And when I do this, you see that we start to see that some of our spacing here. So even though there's no element down here in the third row, it gave us some space for that third row to exist. And notice that the size of this second row is 4 times greater than the size of the first row. And let me also just show you, if I make this wider, the first two didn't change size, but the last one did change size because FR takes up the entire space that is remaining left over. And come back over and it gets smaller, but these two again stay the same size. And that's the same thing as happening with these rows. It's dividing all the size of the entire height into fractional pieces. So if I was to increase this height, so let's give it the height of say, let's say 900 pixels. And now you see that it has expanded so that the footers are taking up 1/6 of that 900, and this middle section is taking up 4/6, or 2/3, and the last one is taking up 1/6. So that's actually, I don't want to have to scroll, so I'm just going to kind of bring this down a little bit, and there we go. That gets us the same effect as what we're looking for. Okay, so now I've set up the grid. It is a 3-column, 3-row grid. And right now, since I haven't positioned any elements specifically, it's just populating that grid based on the HTML. But if I want to determine where each of these elements go, then I can do that by specifically laying out the grid row that I would like to set it in. So let's say the header, I want that to be in the first row. So I'll say grid row 1, and that's telling me where it's going to start. All right, it's going to be in the first row. If I don't indicate any other number, it's just going to take up the first row only. And if I didn't specify any columns, it'd just be exactly where it's at. But I want this grid column now, I want this to be start in the first column, and I actually want the header to go all the way across the top. So I'm going to do 1, and then we'll do span 3. And now you see that my header is starting on the first row and going all the way across the top, spanning 3. So that's one way to establish, and in my opinion, it's the easiest way to do the numbering system. You can't establish which row you want it to stop in, but that number is the first row that it doesn't appear in, and that can be kind of counterintuitive. So I like saying where to start and how many columns it's spanning. It's spanning 3, the first column, the second column, the third column. Now notice that the header has now replaced the footer as the first element to appear. Because it's been specifically selected to go into this position, it's filling up its positions first and leaving the leftover positions for the other unpositioned elements. So if I want to position some other elements, I'm just going to kind of repeat the same thing here. So let's take this grid row and grid column, and let's position our nav bar next. let's put this in the second row, but let's actually span two rows. So we'll span two rows, and our grid column, we're just going to leave it in the first column. We're not going to have it span multiple columns. So now you see the nav bar has taken up the position here in that first column, second row, and third row. It's now taking up the second and third row of the entire first column. And again, it pushed the footer over, and we can now position our main. Let's go ahead and put this main section, and we're going to go ahead and put this in the second row, and it's only going to span one, so no need to put span one. And the columns, we'll start it in 2, and we'll span 2. And there's our main section, leaving our footer down here, pushed all the way to the bottom. But we're going to go ahead and position this in the third row, second column, span 2. And there we go. Now we have the entirety of the page kind of laid out into different sectional pieces based on the grid layout. Now, a couple of other things I want to show you here is I could separate these, give a little bit of spacing going on if I wanted to do that with gap. What gap does is creates spacing between the elements in the columns. So something small like maybe 10 pixels, and there we get a little bit of gapping going on in between. So it doesn't really have too much of an impact up here between the top element and the containing element, but it does have spacing between the two columns here and between these two rows. So the question is, how is this different than margin? Well, remember, margin will collapse vertical margins and will not collapse horizontals. So these two would actually be 20 apart, while the top would still only be 10 if I was using margin, unless I kind of manipulated them around. But gap gives a very even number that makes it easier to kind of fill in these spaces. So let's do one more thing here. Let's go ahead and add one more div here. And so we'll add a div, and we'll give it, this will be the special section. And you see that kind of pops down here at the end until I come in here to the special. And let's go ahead and position this. We'll position this special on row 2. And then in terms of grid, let's put it on the third grid or the third column. And we're not going to make it span any. And now we don't see it at all, right? It's not, you can't see it because it's actually behind the main section. So here's the thing with the benefit to doing this layout with the numbered system is that they can actually overlap with each other. But as we saw, we have a way to fix that. So the main section came before the special section in terms of where we're laid out at. So special is here, and then the main comes in at the end. And remember, as things are positioned using the natural flow, things that come at the end are actually on top of things that came in the beginning. So that's why the main is actually overlapping and covering up the special right now. But I can go ahead and give my special a Z index of something like, say, 2, and that brings it up here to the front, right? It's now back on top. And again, that's just a nice way to indicate that this will allow you to have your elements overlapping if that's something that you want to happen, if that's something you want, some kind of effect you want on your page, is you can actually have your elements overlapping using this grid layout. And then you can impact which one is going to appear on top by using your Z index to get it back to the top of the stack. So as I said, there's a couple different ways to lay this out. This is one way to lay it out using numbers with grid row and grid columns. The other way we're going to do this is to come back here and we'll get rid of this grid template rows and columns. We'll get rid of these as well. And then we'll see how this is looking back to the original view. So there we go. All right, we got our height, we got our gap, and otherwise it's exactly the way we started. And again, footer is back up here, nav bar, special section. So as I told you, there was a way that you could actually lay this out in a more visual way. And that's going to be done with grid areas. So the first thing I'm going to do here is do a grid area. I'm going to label each of my grid areas into, let's call this grid area head, and then we'll give this one just copy this to make it a little faster, and paste it in here. So this one we're going to call head, that's right. This one we will call nav, and this one we'll call special, or just call it, if I can spell. Okay, so by giving each of these their own grid area name, I can now lay out my grid using those names by doing a grid template areas. All right, so grid template areas, here we go. So this establishes kind of a visual representation of what I want to happen. And what I'm going to do here is create rows by different levels of parentheses. And I think it's a nice, easy way to kind of create these rows using a vertical stack here. So each of these represents a row. So on the first row, I want the footer to show up. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a footer. Sorry, I labeled it foot. Let's not put the footer on top. Let's put the head on top. So by doing that, well, let's go ahead and finish it off. You see that everything moved, right? So the head is up on top, and then here we'll do a nav, and then we'll do a main, and then we'll do a special. And down here, we'll do a nav, we'll do a foot, and we'll do a foot. Now that we have them all positioned, now we see everything is laid out kind of the way we would expect it to be, where the head is positioned, the nav, main, special, nav, foot, foot. So you see the nav going up and down here, and it's covering 2 rows here. The foot is covering 2 columns on 1 row, and then the head is up here establishing 3 positions here. So it doesn't quite give us the ability to do fractional pieces the way we might expect it to. So if we want to kind of redistribute this, then we kind of have to come back in here and give it more fractional pieces. So you see how that, by giving that middle section the same twice, it's given it the ability to take up more space. So if I can do it one more time and then one more time, now you see that I have created a 1-4-1 situation like I had before, where this is 4 fractional pieces, the top is 1 fractional piece, and the bottom is 1 fractional piece. So if I wanted to do the same thing with the columns, I could do the same thing where, let's just add another middle column here. And by doing that, again, we expand the middle and we shrink the outsides, because the middle is now taking up 2 fractional pieces of that middle, and the outsides are only getting 1 fractional piece. So you can kind of do that again if you wanted to do that again. We could add another head here. We could add another main. And then add another foot. And again, pushes it, keeping the middle wider and the inside narrower. Or, sorry, the middle wider, the outsides narrower. And that is the visual way to create a grid setup. So again, grid templates are what you're going to use, either grid template column, grid template row to set up specific rows and columns, and then using grid row, grid column to set up individual elements, position individual elements. Or using grid template areas to kind of create a visual representation of how you want it laid out, and then using grid areas to label each of these elements and position them within the grid template area. So hopefully you found this useful and interesting, and if you have any questions, please let me know.